In this video, I'll demonstrate how to replace a gearbox on a MGI zip Navigator. I have with me a piece of foam to put some screws into, a power drill with a Phillips head attachment. I also have a flathead screwdriver and a pair of pliers, along with some lubrication and a rag with my test battery for the MGI zip. Now I'll start by removing the case or the cowling, and then I'll remove the motor controller. So we'll begin by removing the screws from the case and putting them into the foam as I remove them. The two screws on the outer, the middle one does not need to be removed. Round to the other side. It helps to have a magnified tip on your drill bit. That way the screws are easier to remove. Final two are underneath here, two screws here. Okay. So now that these screws have been removed, I'll put them in the pattern that I took them out. I'll focus on the four outer screws for the motor controller. So that's four screws for the motor controller. And now I can take the cowling away and poke the motor controller through the cowling, like so, and we'll put that up there, out of the way. Now I'll focus on the cover over the motor controller. So there's four screws to remove here. Just be quite careful with these so that you don't drop them into the housing of the Navigator. So that's the four screws of the casing, and you can just take that whole casing off and put to the side, like so. And what I will do in this circumstance is I will disconnect all of these leads. It just makes it a little bit easier to work on. So using a pair of pliers, I'll begin by disconnecting the left-hand motor negative and positive, then the battery positive and negative, followed by the right-hand motor negative and positive, and then finally the two plugs I'll remove with my hands, just a little bit finer, like so. And I'll put the motor controller to the side. This way I can now focus on removing the gearbox and the two motors without having any wires connected. So there's four more screws that connect the gearbox to the frame of the Navigator. So just put those screws up the top. Okay, now I can take the two motors and the gearbox completely out of the Navigator's housing. I'll push this up so we've got a bit of room to work with here. And now what I will focus on is disconnecting the motors from the gearbox. So I'll begin by removing, I'll turn the torque up slightly on the drill. Which will allow me to remove these three bolts. There's a third one through here. Okay, and then I'll move on to the next motor. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll stand the 2 motors up on the end and just gently wiggle them. I just haven't got one of these bolts out enough, so just a little bit more. Allows me to remove the motor. And again, the motor on the other side. So what I'll do is I'll keep these 2 motors in the same spot that I removed them from, not to get confused with what's left and what's right. So this is the gearbox, and this is the replacement gearbox that I'm going to install. So I'll need to get these 6 bolts out of the original gearbox. So again, we'll just place this gearbox down. That's 2, 3 and 4, and then there's a final 2 bolts that are located in the middle. There's 1, and I might just need to poke it out slightly. So that's 2. Okay, so that's the 6 bolts, and this gearbox can now be put to the side. I'll put that out of our way, and then we'll focus on the new gearbox. So this is the replacement. The first thing I'll point out is that we have these red caps. These red caps need to be loosened off because the tip of the motor here will go into this red cap. There's a little slot there that aligns the tip of the motor to these red caps. So if you keep these red caps loose, when you insert the motor, it will go directly into this red cap, and then you can fasten so that it's a nice firm connection. So before anything else, we'll focus on these gaskets that we need to install. So you'll notice that when installing this gasket, there will be a half moon shape that you line up with both holes. There's a half moon there and a half moon there. Hopefully you can see that with the camera. And if you need to, just to keep it in position, I'll use a tiny bit of lubricant. We're using Petroleum Jelly as a lubricant. You can just put a little bit on the outside, and it actually keeps the gasket in position instead of having it fall out of position. So we can again line up the, we'll have to flip this over so it's in the right spot. Line up the half moon on this side and the half moon on the other. And again, using a little bit of petroleum jelly just to hold the gasket into the right spot. Okay, so when reinstalling, I'd like to put just a little bit of extra petroleum jelly around the tip of the motors, so that when it does install into the red caps, it's nice and smooth. And now we'll focus on installing each motor. So, as I said, keeping this motor in the same spot that you removed it from will prevent you from getting confused as where it belongs to. So it may take a little bit of wiggling or manoeuvring, and you may actually have to take the red cap off. So with this circumstance, I will take the red cap off just so we can align it correctly. Or at least loosen it up so that when we can put the motor into position, it'll line up. So we can now line up the 3 screws, and I'll fasten these one by one. So starting with the top one, not overly firm, just firm enough so that it's in position. And again, the second one on the left hand side, and the third one will be through the centre. So just get down here so we can get a better view. And again, having a magnetised tip on the drill bit helps. Okay, so that's the third installed. Now if I just take this red cap off, just loosen these screws all the way off, you'll be able to see where it connects. So you can see that the tip of the motor is there, and there's a entry port for this red cap. So what I'll do is I'll take these three screws out, and then I'll install the red cap like so. So it's in the right position, and I'll start off by fastening top, then the left, and then the right. So now that we know the red cap, the motor, the gearbox is all aligned correctly. Following the same procedure on the right hand side. Inserting the motor into position until flush, and then lining up the ports so that we can put the screws through. So that's one. Two, and the third through the inside. So that's complete, and now you'll notice that this red cap just sits in position well, so I can fasten these screws until firm. Okay, so now the new gearbox has been fitted with the existing motors. So now I want to focus on installing that into the frame of the Navigator. So we'll pull this back here. Now the first thing I'll do is just tuck these wires out of the way so that we don't get them caught up. And I will slot the two motors into their groove, and you'll see that the gearbox just fits back into position like so, and these wires haven't been caught up on anything. So now I will fasten the gearbox to the frame of the Navigator using the existing screws. Now when I install, I like to have this on a lower torque setting, so I'll turn this down to about, so probably even 5, and that way I won't strip any of the plastic when reinstalling. Okay, so now the gearbox is in position. I'll focus on fitting the plastic cowling. Now feed all the wires through this cowling, so that way I know I'm not getting anything caught up on the plastic. And when reinstalling, just ensuring that this plastic is sitting in where the motors sit. They're sitting on the inside on both sides, and lining up the top so that it's nice and flush here. And you'll see that everything's fitting into position correctly. So what I will do is I'll put just 2 screws down the base here. That's just sitting the cowling back into position, and I'll do the 2 screws up the top also. Okay, so that's got it temporarily fixed, and what I will do is now reinstall the wiring to the motor controller. So starting on the right hand side, we'll start with the green motor. R is for green. Easy way to tell is the second letter is G-R-E-E-N. R is right, G-R for right hand side. So we'll start with the positive, connect, and then the negative. Then I'll continue over to the battery. The battery doesn't have a colour, which is just plain positive and negative. So just copying what it says here, you can see that it says negative there, and then positive. And then blue, B-L-U-E, is L for left. That's how I remember which is left and which is right. So the left-hand motor negative, and then positive. So they're all installed correctly. Now I'll focus on installing the stem cable by just plugging that back into the board, and then the sensor lead by plugging that in. Okay, now you'll also see that there's a groove where the motor controller leads sit, so they just need to sit back into the positions that they were taken from when putting the case back on. So we'll just hold these wires in position, and we'll fit the case on. Again, being careful not to lose any of these screws in the housing, because they can be difficult to recover. And just lightly fitting this case on, and then checking to see that the wires are all in their proper grooves, which they are. That's nice, and then we'll just tighten these up. Okay, so now the case is fitted, we can reinstall the controller into the housing, like so. Just keeping the leads tucked in underneath. And now the controller is back into the housing, and we'll use these 4 screws to fasten the controller back into the housing. Okay, so that's the motor controller fitted. Now we'll work on the outside 2 screws that I removed originally. And the 2 larger screws are the next one along. Two larger screws on the other side. And the 2 small screws on the far side towards the axle. Okay, so that's how to replace a gearbox on a MGI Zip Series buggy. Once this has been installed, please follow the trimming procedure, which will be to hold down the start-stop button for up to 5 seconds, and the Navigator will find its own bearings. You'll need to walk behind it in a flat area around 20 meters, and it should auto trim itself so that it runs in a direct straight line. And then obviously test run the buggy to make sure everything's working correctly before returning to the customer. Thanks for watching.